A divided Supreme Court has outlawed affirmative action in college admissions, has said that race cannot be used any longer. That's right. This is from our friends at the Associated Press. The Supreme Court on Thursday struck down affirmative action in college admission, declaring that race cannot be a factor and forcing institutions of higher education to look for new ways to achieve diverse student bodies. The court's conservative majority effectively overturned cases reaching back 45 years and invalidating plans at Harvard and the University of North Carolina, the nation's oldest private and public colleges, respectively. Now, this decision, just like last year's monumentous abortion ruling that overturned Roe v. Wade, marked the realization of a long-sought conservative legal goal, this time finding that race-conscious admissions plans violate the Constitution and a law that applies to colleges that receive federal funding, as almost all do. Those schools will be forced to reshape their admissions practices, especially top schools that are more likely to consider the race of applicants. Chief Justice John Roberts said that for too long, universities have concluded wrongly that the touchstone of an individual's identity is not challenges beset, skills built, or lessons learned, but the color of their skin. Our constitutional history does not tolerate that choice. He does know that the Constitution was written by people who literally owned slaves, right? Okay, but that's neither here nor there. From the White House, President Joe Biden said that he strongly disagreed with the court's ruling and urged colleges to seek other routes to diversity rather than let the ruling be the last word. Now, besides the conservative-liberal split, the fight over affirmative action showed the deep gulf between the three justices of color, each of whom wrote separately and vividly about race in America and where the decision might lead. Justice Clarence Thomas, the nation's second black justice who had long called for an end to affirmative action, wrote that the decision sees the university's admissions policies for what they are: rudderless, race-based class preferences designed to ensure a particular racial mix in their entering classes. Justice Sonia Sotomayor, the court's first Latina, wrote in dissent that the decision rolls back decades of precedent and monumentous progress. Woo! Where do I start? Okay, so let's just give a quick summary of the affirmative action cases. The conservative majority that won said specific victims of specific identifiable discriminatory acts can receive repair. Okay. Liberal dissent was that because slavery and colonialism victimized, brutalized African Americans and indigenous people, everyone who is a person of color should benefit through diversity initiatives. That's basically it on some level. Now, here's what a lot of people are not talking about, especially in the liberal sphere, which is basically where most black people get their news from. Let's just be real here. This ruling actually leaves the door open for African Americans specifically who are descended from slavery to be able to bring about a case stating that we, as the descendants of slavery, or say indigenous people who were colonized and had the land stolen from them to make this country, have a argument to have affirmative action based just for us. The ruling essentially says that diversity for diversity's sake is not constitutional, but it does not say that African Americans and say indigenous people who had their land taken from them should not get there should not be special privileges for them on some level. That is something that could be reevaluated and sort of restated in the future. I'm surprised that you didn't see more black people stating that. I mean, I guess I'm not surprised, because the modern culture of American liberalism, and I think Western liberalism in general, has been to pull themselves up on African Americans, the descendants of slavery in this country. So while there is an argument that African Americans and say indigenous people as well could be able to have some sort of affirmative action because of what specifically happened to us in the future, what that does is it seems it essentially eliminates immigrants and white women and gays and all these other people who have sort of latched on to affirmative action over the past 50 years, which I actually think is a good thing on some level. Diversity for diversity's sake is essentially what's being chucked here. It's just saying if you have a specific evil that was done to you, then you can, you might be able to have some sort of affirmative action or some sort of admissions that does that. I actually support that. I've always thought that affirmative action should apply to Native Indigenous people and African Americans, and that's it. Okay? Affirmative action, as it was being served and meted out, no longer served African Americans and indigenous people anyway. Most of the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action were white women. White women were the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action. And in the black community, a large percentage of the people who were benefited from affirmative action were immigrants, people whose ancestors did not build this country, whose ancestors did not go through slavery, Jim Crow, did not have the government killing all their civil rights leaders, did not have to go through decades of lynching. And as we talked about a few weeks ago, look through the archives or look on my YouTube page, my YouTube channel, Scott Cannon WLTH, did not have decades of land loss because the land was stolen from them. A large percentage of the black people who were benefiting from affirmative action were the Karine Jean-Pierres of the world or the Barack Obamas of the world, who were products of immigration. When specifically affirmative action, the whole point of affirmative action was, look, we did really bad things to African Americans, we did really bad things to Native Americans, and so that's why we're supposed to do this to sort of make up for that on some level, but it wasn't even doing that. You had white women, you had immigrants, you had gays, you had all these other groups of people benefiting from some level of affirmative action other than black people. And by black people, I mean African Americans who come from slaves and indigenous peoples. That's who it should have always applied to. That's who it should have always applied to. So I know a lot of black people are looking at this as a 100% a loss, and oh my God, but on some level, this could be a blessing in disguise. This could be a blessing in disguise, especially if there are smart people out there who will be able to then say, okay, fine, there is no flat blackness. A black kid from Detroit whose family came from Mississippi is not the same thing as a black kid from whose parents came from Jamaica, or whose parents came from Africa. They are not the same. The kid from Detroit whose family's from Mississippi had a very specific thing done to his family and his community in this country, and that is what makes him eligible for some form of affirmative action, not just the fact that he is black in itself. Not that he's, you know what I mean? So I think a lot of these people, Indians and Chinese people and all these other people who on some level have benefited from affirmative action over the years, I think this is definitely an end to that for them. I think that we as African Americans have to regroup and make our case specifically as the descendants of chattel slavery. As the descendants of chattel slavery, we have a different case than these other people. And it's important. It's important that we remember that we have a different case than these people. We are not the same as them. We're all black, but we're not the same type of black. Now, obviously, the conservatives weren't thinking about that when they said that. People like Clarence Thomas and them just wanted to get rid of it, period. But the way that they wrote the decision was not in a way that excludes considering slavery, the descendants of slavery, and the descendants of colonialism in this country for affirmative action. Now, here's something that people also have not been talking about a lot. They left affirmative action, that form of affirmative action, in military schools. So military schools can still, I guess by their standards, discriminate based on race and use race as a admittance tool if they want to. Now, why would they do that? Why would they say it's wrong for colleges to admit based on race, but the military can admit based on race? Could it be because minorities disproportionately make up the military and die in all these colonial imperial wars all over the world? I think that's what it is. It's okay to put a disproportionate amount of black people out there, or Hispanics, or whoever out there, to die in Iraq or some random country that they've never even heard of before they were shipped there to go kill brown and black people. That's okay, but it's not okay for that to be used to get them a place in a classroom. All this does is signal an end to the sort of minority categorizing, the type of grouping that goes with minority, where we're just all put. I complain about that regularly, how, white liberals just put us in a basket of minorities. That's it. We're all just minorities. Black people, white women, gays, Hispanics, Asians, we're all just minorities. Well, there is no flat minority experience in this country. There are the people whose ancestors either built this country or were massacred to build this country. And then there's people who came here to sort of exploit America's resources and exploit America's prosperity. No hate. I got immigrants in my family. I'm not hating on anybody. I'm just saying that's just what it is. But, like I said, lineage-based affirmative action is still something that is possible, even with the way that this decision is written. That is something that African Americans, now don't get me wrong, I would not be surprised if the Black Miss Leadership class purposely ignores this, and makes African Americans suffer just because they can no longer lump us in with everybody else. I don't put that beyond the Democratic Party. I don't put that beyond liberals, because that, again, using African Americans to prop themselves up is what they do. So I would not be surprised, but it absolutely does. There is a sort of pathway for that to happen, for lineage-based affirmative action that calls for it calls for some form of affirmative action for the descendants of American slavery, American chattel slavery, or the descendants of the people who were massacred, the indigenous people, to build this country. So that is still possible. One thing that I think this also makes clear is that, again, white women are not minorities. They're not. Okay? The majority of them were against affirmative action. And you can see in the polls, the majority, I think it's 70% of white women oppose affirmative action. but the majority of them benefited from affirmative action. When affirmative action started, they only made up 3% of the lawyers in the country. Now white women make up 30% of the lawyers in the country. Okay? See, this is what I'm saying. And again, African Americans have been just grouped into this sort of forced marriage with all these different groups that do not have our interest in mind. And so now white women have benefited from for 5 decades from affirmative action more than anybody else. But we get all the blame. African Americans have gotten all the blame in terms of who gets blamed for affirmative action. Oh, affirmative action is there so that mediocre black people can get to the same place as white people do. So hopefully this ends that delusion as well, that like I said, we are all on the same team. We are not all on the same team. We are not. They are smart enough to know that family wealth is what matters. Whether they make it or their husband makes it or their father makes it, it's all going to the same place. They get the Gucci bag regardless. They get the Manolo Blahniks regardless. Whether they buy it for themselves or their husband buys it for them or their father buys it for them, they get the Gucci bag either way. Now, I think a lot of black women especially have not understood that about the feminist movement for the last 5 decades, but I hope you understand it now. You know, also, I think a lot of people, a lot of liberals are downplaying the fact that Clarence Thomas, who's gotten a lot of the heat for his specific role in overturning affirmative action, especially after he benefited from it himself, he would not be on the Supreme Court at all if it was not for our current president. Possibly, I'll say he will possibly not be on the Supreme Court if it wasn't for our current president, Joseph Robinette Biden. So if you're looking for somebody to blame, you can look at Joe Biden's role in Clarence Thomas even being on the Supreme Court. He voted against him technically. But when Joe Biden chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing in 1991, when Anita Hill presented allegations that Clarence Thomas had sexually harassed her, for some context, Anita Hill told that committee in details about her experience, saying that Thomas spoke about acts that he had seen in pornographic movies, involving scenes such as women having sex with animals, and films showing group sex or rape. That is what Anita Hill testified to. As the chair of that committee, Joe Biden was criticized because he refused to call 3 other witnesses who reported that they had their own sexual harassment complaints about Clarence Thomas. Despite Anita Hill's testimony, Clarence Thomas was confirmed with a narrow 52-48 margin. So just think about if those three other witnesses had been allowed to testify, then you might have had a situation in which Clarence Thomas does not get on the Supreme Court in 1991. So again, you sort of have to look at a man who, you know, I can't. We're going to talk about Joe Biden and his family in the next segment as well. Well, in the segment after next, because we got to talk about Trump. We got to talk about Trump first, and how out and out, you know, dumb he is. But before we go to a break, I just want to say this, right? A lot of people complain about affirmative action and say that it flies in the face of a merit-based system. But I want you to take this into context. 43% of the white students at Harvard, 43%, that's almost half, are legacy students or student athletes. 75% of them would not be admitted otherwise to Harvard. Now remember, we just had a huge scandal last year, the year before last, with all these Hollywood celebrities who were paying off these colleges to admit their kids into these colleges, manipulating the college admittance process. That's what rich white people do. They say pretend you have an extracurricular activity, and they pretend that their daughter plays a sport or their daughter is on the drill team or something. Right, so they do that, right? And that's how they get into a lot of these schools. Even at the University of Michigan, the University of Michigan case, which was one of the famous anti-affirmative action cases, there were more white legacy students at the University of Michigan than there were black students who benefited from affirmative action. But they claim they want a meritocracy. They claim they want a meritocracy. Have you seen one lawsuit brought against the school because white legacy students get in because of who their parents were? Or because their parents paid money for them to get in? Of course not. Of course not. So no, a lot of these minorities, I will say the Asians who say that they are disproportionately affected, these are, look, especially the Indians, these are people who come from a country with a caste system. We talked about it the other week when we did the segment on Vivek Ramaswamy and Nikki Haley. These are people who can coon it up too. It's not just black people. Black people aren't the only people who coon it up for white supremacy. No. Lots of minorities coon it up for white supremacy. That's what a lot of minorities do. They coon it up for white supremacy. So right, and so they're willing to essentially push down other people, what are called people of color, in order to prop themselves up and say, look at us. We are the most adjacent to white people. That's why you won't see any lawsuits from them about the white people who get into Harvard over them because their parents paid money for them to get in, or because their parents were former alumni of Harvard. You won't see any lawsuits about that. But if they see a black person in there that they don't believe belongs there, then you better believe they're going to file that lawsuit. And then they try to lay a guilt trip on black people. They go, well, don't you want people to think that you got in on your own merit? Why would you want to go somewhere where people would think that you're an affirmative action admittance? I go, well, where's the guilt trip of George W. Bush? Why are black people the only people who are supposed to feel guilty about getting someplace? Nobody asked the George W. Bushes or the Donald Trumps or the Mitt Romneys of the world to feel guilty about getting into a college over more deserving people. But that's how you know that this decision and that the lawsuits have always been about anti-blackness, anti-African American bias. They see the George W. Bushes of the world, they see the Mitt Romneys of the world, they see the Donald Trumps of the world as being deserving because they have the right bloodline. That automatically makes them more deserving than you. So as African American people descended from chattel slavery, we have to regroup. We can't neglect the HBCUs anymore. I have to say that. I did not go to an HBCU, but I do support that they exist, you know. And I think a lot of black people are going to have to start investing in our own institutions from here on out. You cannot rely on, you know, white liberals to essentially shepherd you into the status quo anymore. You know, it's time to look out for number one being the African American community, if you are an African American, and stop waiting for somebody to let you into their club. It's like my man Ice Cube talking about the gatekeepers, keeping him out. You know, the gatekeepers. There's these gatekeepers who are doing everything they can to sabotage the big three. The big three is Ice Cube's basketball league. He's the first black man in American history. He's acknowledged now as the first black man in American history to own a major sports league. And the NBA is doing everything possible to make sure that his league fails. Now, he's not even competing with the NBA. His league is during the summer. By the time the NBA season starts, his season is done. The big three season is already done. But the NBA is still sabotaging him, and the major networks are still sabotaging him because he does not belong. In their eyes, he doesn't belong. He doesn't have the complexion for the protection. And so I think a lot of black people have gone to sleep over the years. Hopefully you're woke now. All right, folks, we got to go to a commercial break. Our very first commercial break. Please stay with us here on WLTH 1370 AM. When we get back, we're going to talk about our former president, the corruption of our former president, and our current president. We'll be right back after these.